Hello. This is interessantes. Boom, boom, boom. Hang on a second. Hello, Adam. Mr. Muted. Mr. Still Muted.
Hi there.
Hello.
Ori, great to talk to you. Hi, Adam.
Hello, Fabian. This is so cool. I'm just going to have to share my screen for a minute while we're waiting for the rest.
Mm-hmm.
So for my PhD, I'm currently conducting a survey on Prolific, which is a service where you can pay people to take surveys. You know, they have to answer, well, they have to answer a few questions, but also you can target people just like you can with a Facebook ad or something like that. So for this one, I have targeted people who are at university or have recently graduated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a survey of 200 people. But look here at the top, see the numbers going up? It started about half an hour ago. I did 10 earlier as a bit of a pilot to see if there was anything funny with the responses, and everything's fine. But it's just bang, bang.
That's perfect. If you're just curious about something without doing a PhD, you could even think about surveys when you build something, you want to get quick feedback.
Yeah, it's such a quick way to get responses. Yeah. Oh, we're filling up. Very good.
Hi there.
Hello, David. Hello, David. And I know Mr. Anderson will join us in a minute. But yeah, I just wanted to show this really interesting thing called Prolific. So I have gotten an account here for my university for my PhD. So I'm doing 200 people testing to do a survey. That's not it. That's on here on Google. And the colors are really weird. I cannot customize the colors, but Edgar, come. Red, okay, so as you can see here, or maybe blue is great. Red is second great, which is just odd. But if you look at the blue and the red, so this is all about visual meta. Look at this, it's pretty good, right? 172 people so far.
Nice, thanks.
So yeah, here's a neutral one. Yeah, these were the final ones. These are, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but it's a set of specific HCI questions.
You did it first. I still see read.
Oh, really? That's great, Edgar.
Why?
Do you want to come and say hi to everyone?
No.
Okay. What? Hang on. Edgar, oh, Mommy, can you close the door, please? There's a meeting thing.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, they just came back. Anyway, I just thought it's kind of cool. You see, we started talking with 171, now it's already 173. So it's going very, very fast. And yeah, this is what might be interesting is, let me just find it there. Right. So this, sorry, it reloads a bit weirdly. Yeah, the final questions. I would use it frequently, unnecessarily complex, easy to use, supportive of technical. These are standard HCI questions that can then be graded on a specific way rather than me deciding everything. So that's kind of an interesting last bit. And now we're at 173. Anyway, hello, everyone.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, we seem to be relatively full capacity now, unless Edgar comes in and joins us again, in which case we'll be over. Right, so some of us have been thinking and working on what would happen if we had 10 million visual meta documents, and think of visual meta as just being another way of saying documents with good metadata, both how they connect and internal, how we could derive value from that, how we could visualize that, Peter, do you want to mention the email that you sent yesterday about what your friend told you about that?
Okay, I consulted a friend who's an archivist, and she pointed me to a Library of Congress data set sale page that indicated that there are around 9.5 million authors in the current CD-ROM version of their authority name file, and that the last update to that file added approximately 300,000. So 300,000 were added over like a 2-year window after the last officially minted version of the database came out, which suggests maybe 150,000 new authors being added a year, roughly. So for our 10 million document collection, there are already over 9.5, maybe 10, 11 million authors that are known to the world through Library of Congress. Now, since a lot of those documents would represent texts that had been authored long before Visual Meta, we can assume that they would only be represented in the 10 million collection if they were cited into by recently authored documents. Since I doubt anyone's going to go back and start generating Visual Meta for older texts, unless, of course, they're highly significant to their research. So if there were some key books from the 1800s talking about Hamilton, they might get fully augmented with Visual Meta after the fact by someone other than their original author, and they would come fully into the 10 million data set. Whereas other texts like, pulp fiction written in the 1600s would probably never get reflected or cited except maybe by some specialist literature professor. But they really, for a large number of those texts, wouldn't appear within our 10 million set. There are some wonderful, I just started researching this yesterday, libraries available for mocking large data sets from the data science community. So if we can come up with a sense of distribution and statistics, we would be able to generate a mock data set on the size scale that we're thinking about that we could then play with in terms of visualizations. So the kinds of questions that we'd want to be asking would be the breakdown of books by how many authors they'd have. So what percentage of our 10 million documents are going to be single author texts versus multi-author texts, 2 authors, 3 authors? You can assume that each additional author will significantly reduce the percentage of texts that have that number of authors to them. We could also then, since Visual Meta is highly dependent upon the connections between documents, I think we should start thinking about how we can model and mock up authors themselves. So what you have to assume is that each author may have belonged to 1 or 2 universities or research groups within them. So we should mock up universities. That we can get a pretty good hard number as to how many universities are out there. Then we can again figure a distribution. What percentage of authors would have gone to one university? What percentage would have gone on for graduate studies? I'm not quite sure where we could get those statistics, but it's something that we can think about. Again, the more degrees get slapped on, the fewer authors are going to have that number. So then what we can do is use one of these mocking systems to generate representative authors attached to our imaginary mock universities. So one author might have gone to, Alpha University and Gamma University. Another author would have only been associated with one. Then within the universities, you can model departments and research groups. Again, assume maybe there are 20 active departments at a given university, randomly assign the authors to imaginary departments in the university. You could also maybe model that some authors absolutely despise other authors, so under no circumstances would that pair appear as co-authors in a text. And you can assume that any text that is authored by one, if it were to cite into the other one, would be citing it in a negative manner as opposed to a positive manner. Again, we can model the kinds of signals, which signals is a term that the legal community uses in terms of the polarity of citations. So you could have mildly criticizing, just citing for information in the work. Again, we can come up with a little bit of an ontology there, and then randomly associate each work with an arbitrary number of other works that it would be directly citing. And that way we'd be able to simulate the citation chains between works. We can do the same sort of thing with topics, assume that a book's not going to be on more than a certain number of topics. We can also observe that events in the real world can trigger a flurry of books. For instance, when the play Hamilton first achieved critical acclaim, we can assume that within maybe 18 months of that, a large number of books would have been released related to Alexander Hamilton and his life and times. So you can start pulling those things together, and that sort of richness would be in the database. So I imagine that the database could have some historical event markers associated with it, in addition to the book titles. And then you could know that you might want to look and scan forward from a particular point in time after an event to see books that were immediately related to that. That's also significant with people's deaths. You'll see a slew of biographies come out after they die within a short window of time. Major presidential elections and political disputes, again, have a certain lag, and then a flurry of books related to them. And that could be a useful filtering function to help winnow down the data set to a number of entities that could be reasonably visualized at one time. Probably the most useful PhD dissertation out there would be Stuart Allen Sutton's dissertation I mentioned on a few occasions. And the title of that was Managing Legal Information, a Model of Institutional Memory Based on User Cognitive Maps. So that's a great text. And the way it deals with the proliferation of entities is to create synthetic centroids associated with clusters of similar documents. So instead of representing 200 books about Alexander Hamilton, the system might notice that there's a cluster of strongly related items that are all citing into the same body of previous literature and represent them as a single Alexander Hamilton books visually in the graphic. And then when you identify that cluster, you could zoom into it, throw away everything else, and then get a detailed visualization of your Hamilton stat. Okay, I see a bunch of hands up, so
Alan, just
break,
wanted to
catch my
mention
breath,
before
set
you
my
jump in,
override.
just wanted to mention before you jump in, Alan, that to some of you who weren't in on the email discussion, we're fantasizing a little bit based on Vince having a presentation that includes humanities and supercomputing. And I just threw out the idea of 10 million documents. And as a little email I sent yesterday, if you imagine a computer monitor of roughly 24 inches, each single pixel, if you count them, that's 11 million. So it gives a sense of how many documents that would be. Alan.
Great, a lot of information there. And I read some of the email. And side note, I hope that the deadline hasn't been passed for future of text. But if it is, then so be it.
It has passed, but
okay.
I don't think that's going to be a problem. I will be spending the next week actually building the thing. So if you manage over the next few days, that goes for all of you. If you haven't submitted, you do have a few more days. But I know this is recorded, but don't tell anyone else that.
Advantages of being in the I was going to say inside group, but coterie. Anyway, okay, so just to back up a bit, and you may have already discussed this, but if you're talking about a large data set, massively large, you are inevitably talking about automating the process of transcribing or moving from PDF to visual meta. That is unavoidable. I mean, you can mechanical Turk it to a point. Okay, well, and maybe that's debatable.
No, the idea is going forward so that they would be natively made. So if we build systems where adding visual meta is just part of easy workflow, it's not a matter of going into what currently exists.
Okay, then maybe I misunderstand. When I hear, say, the number 1 million, PDFs that you want to have visual meta. In my mind, the only way to get there, even if they are low quality transcriptions, if you will, is to figure out a way to automate some of that. So I'm just wondering, has that discussion happened or started? Because I know that's intimidating, and it's also often going to lead to bad results, but that's really the only way to bootstrap, in my mind, jumping up to a huge data set.
I had a meeting with Dave King yesterday of exaptive.com. Just put the URL in the chat. He does really cool graph things, and he is going to enable visual meta documents to be parsed directly into that environment. And he said a nice little sentence: a standard is only a standard if other people use it. So,
oh yeah,
right. So I just thought that was obvious, but quite nice. But to address your point, Alan, there's got to be, like anything else, even if you're selling apples and oranges, there's got to be a value in the product, and the production has to be low. So as to your point of adding the visual meta, it has to be basically invisible for the user or the publisher. That is a huge point. And what I'm trying to do now is look at the fantasy side of things. You know, what would it be like? And then go to publishers and saying, you know, because we're most likely doing Web Science, which is a huge conference next year, saying if you don't just do this basic stuff, if you add these other things, then you get these amazing things. And for me to say 10 million, that was just to be provocative. It's just, you know, a large number of documents that are produced by publisher or others. What can we actually do? Because, you know, Doug Engelbart, he told me a story once. Someone came in really annoyed in the office and says, Doug, the problem with you is that you're a dreamer. And he said, dreaming is hard work. I think this is an example of dreaming is hard work.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think there's a lot of opportunity to think in the space of automation as an evangelist for the tool. Meaning, imagine if you're on stage, giving a presentation, and instead of walking through all of the bits of syntax, you can take a PDF, hit a button, see the results in metadata and in visual meta. And it may not be the best results. It may just be, here's draft one, you know? And that could be, I mean, well, the opportunities are unbounded on how that can be improved, right? But starting to think that way and actually sort of like, how can we tackle this? I think is fundamental. Even in the sense of, if you don't want to automate 1 million, 10 million documents, even if that wasn't the case, the user experience of hitting a button and then seeing named entity recognition, seeing other bits of low-hanging fruit fill out the space is also instructive on how to use it. And it gets them over that huge onboarding friction of, what do I do with this new thing? I'm most likely going to do it wrong, you know? Yeah.
I had a talk with Chris Guttridge today, who was a colleague of Mark and me. He's a genius, but sometimes too much genius on this. And he's the one who replied to the email saying, oh, it doesn't matter if it's visual metadata, metadata is metadata. It's like, oh, for crying out loud. Anyway, so he didn't realize that visual meta includes markup of what's inside the document. So just kind of wanted to throw that in there with what you're talking about on what it actually could be. It's not just what the document is, sorry. And this is something the authoring tools, they just have to help. They just have to make it obvious, right?
Agreed.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's an orthogonal problem to the question of how we'd visualize the 10 million document data set. So Alan's thinking about the question of how you would author an item going into that data set, but I think what Vint needs most of all is what you'd be doing with the data set, assuming that it already existed. So we're projecting for Vint's talk maybe 10, 15 years forward, where all of the people in academia are enthusiastically behind visual meta, and everything that they're turning out is fully augmented to the greatest degree possible. And then with that data set, what can we do?
Yeah,
Okay.
one thing that's kind of interesting and related to this is this survey that I'm doing. I now have 186 responses. It should be 200 soon, and that's where we're going. Because this particular issue here, this is about people making definitions as they're working, and most of you know how that maps out and everything, goes into a glossary. So look at this. The red and the blue are the really strongly supportive of it. That's a little bit surprising. Sorry, Mark, I saw you have your hand up. I'll go right over to you, I'm sorry. This is extra work for them. But they seem to feel that if they can do this, it helps them express and think better. So that becomes really specifically useful metadata. We'll go through all that later, but yes, Mark, I hope you had a horrible holiday and hope you're very happy to be back here with us.
No, I had a very good holiday. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I wasn't here. And hello to a couple of faces I think that are new to this little forum. I was going to throw in a couple of things. I did see Chris Gushridge's email, which didn't surprise me at all. It was somewhat terse. But I'm riffing off a couple of things he mentioned. And I suppose looking at this from two levels is it's a bit chicken egg, because what we can do depends on the metadata we put in, and VM is open in its general structure. But one of the things that occurs to me as these numbers come up is, so we almost need sort of tools, or sort of middle-level tools that says, well, what information have I got to play with? I mean, because it's terribly easy to have an imagined perfect end, but there are some steps on the way. You know, we can't query or visualize the strands of metadata that don't exist. And I'll tie that one off there. The other one is more at the higher end. Another aspect of having millions of documents with however many pixels we have on the screen is just sheer space. So you need some collapsing, some elision of the content. And I recall, I think it was one of our previous discussions here, we drew the distinction between the old-fashioned infographic, which sheds lots of data in effort to give clarity, and it does, but it's entirely static. When you try and do that dynamically, it's often a bit of a pot mess, despite your best efforts, because it's very hard, sort of on the fly, to have that degree of control. So, ooh, we want a bit less of this and more of another. That said, I've been fascinated, you know, just by the stuff with Adam's visualizations done the other day. This idea of being able to pull stuff in and out of focus. So you have a peripheral sense of, crikey, there's more stuff there, but I don't need the immediate emphasis. And I think one of the things that you know, building out this metadata should allow us to do is almost to see a sort of relationship and then be able to abstract that almost into a separate thinking space. So here's this map, I've got, oh, right, all these things, grab that. I want to look at the relationship between these, which is one way of getting around this thing of having an everything bucket, because I do think our visualization tools, for all the effort that goes into them, are at actually a very naive stage, and they're mainly coming out of basically trying to make money out of social networks, which is a whole different ballgame. And I think actually, frankly, totally irrelevant to the sort of relationships we're looking at here, because it's a lot of the relationships that we're looking at in the context of documents and things are not as fixed as affinity things. It's much looser. It's things that are like. So it's finding a way. It's thinking how we can do this sort of almost dynamic abstraction. We can take the whole boat of 10 million items or something, put probably a quite loose query across them of some sort using the available metadata, and then probably literally saying, right, take that lot, sort of put that into a different desktop, as it were, space, call it whatever you will. And now I can start to play games with this in the sort of open Weblo style tabletop that we've talked about. You start to play about with the relationships. You drive it, not the computer. One of our weaknesses at the moment is we're trapped in this mire of collect all the stuff, magic AI phase, answer, which is more often than not completely useless. He gets an answer, but to no good effect. What we're missing are the things that allow us to take a whole lot of stuff and use our human cognitive ability to give it shape and structure, and then possibly actually effectively write metadata back into it, because we actually record relationships we see, and we record the semantics of why we're recording that relationship.
But this discussion, Mark, does really highlight how difficult this is, because we still haven't actually talked about what we could do. You know, it's like, you know, you've been invited to a big party, you're still wondering what to wear, you know, but what would you do at the party, right? The issues you and Alan brought up are really, really important. But in terms of having a space and time where this fantasy world has happened to help us guide ourselves towards it is still a problem.
One thing I certainly would love to see is being able to put the temporal axis back into things. I, like a number of others here, have been reading books on the sort of basically the history of annotation, book creation, all these things which weren't certainties before they existed. So the fixed structures we have now came about in all sorts of odd ways. But current style of telling stories makes a good narrative, but they jump all over the timeline. And it really messes with the brain, because I find I'm constantly trying to work out where were these things happening? When were they happening? Because that actually is a really missing part of the story that is normally elided by the author because they don't think it's germane to their narrative. But from a knowledge-making perspective, which is one of the areas we're sort of talking about here, it's actually very important. So part of the visualization, part of this, what will we do with these documents, is we would be able to provide, well, you could say other narratives, other trails through the data set that are not in the immediate narrative of the documents themselves. So that's something. Does that push things forward for you?
Just to be really horrible, since you're a close friend, all you said is we can do more. Which is
no, we can do
useful,
different. Well, no, we can do different.
Yeah, more.
Yes, more, but well, I mean, how different do you want it to be? Or...
Well, let's enlarge that a bit. I see Peter's got his hand up.
Yeah. One thing I would like would be to be able to see the pedigree of authors. I've noticed a few different people in discussions of the literature have talked about the chains of who studied under whom, particularly on the mathematics side, it seems. But in the math side, people often talk about, you know, who was the thesis advisor, who was his thesis advisor, and, you know, you trace it back to Gauss or someone really, really famous. And then you look at what topics the people who studied under them studied. So you can sort of follow the development of the literature over time based upon that chain of mentorship relations. So it'd be really nice if we could highlight the mentorship relations. Thinking more about visual meta and the timeline idea that Mark had, it would be nice if you included quotations in the visual meta. So now let's imagine that author had make a quotation affordance that included prompting the user for the date that the thing being quoted was said or written. So now, because you can't just go by the book, since a given book is going to be citing quotations spread over, you know, the last quarter of a century before the book was written, if not further back. But if you had the date associated with that, then we could go into this giant data set and say, show me all of the books that quoted Hamilton and what things did Hamilton say that they were quoted, and even all of the books that shared a common quote from Hamilton. And that kind of thing could be a very, very powerful focusing device that we don't have now.
Yeah, and I just quickly add, and as useful as the anti-pattern, in the sense that in doing that, you're looking as much for the holes, the absence of information, as you are. Yeah, because, you know, why is there a hole in this big enormous, you know, we thought we had all the information. Why is there a hole where there shouldn't be one?
New book, I apologize. It's interesting.
What book is that?
Because
Hold that back up again so I can get a screen grab.
Yeah.
the thing you were talking about, Peter, is partly talking about how knowledge in whatever field has changed, right? So yeah, I mean, this book is about how we need to look at, in the light of climate change and the Anthropocene, can we view knowledge in the same way? It goes way back to when we started thinking abstract thoughts, and I've only gotten into the very, very beginning. But yeah, to be able to trace things back is clearly useful.
Also, certainly from the law side, there's been talk about tracing things going forward. One of the chapters in Stewart's dissertation talked about the evolution of a body of law over time. So what he did was he created an attribute graph having a couple attributes associated with why a court falls in a given way. And he looked at manslaughter cases and passion, with one axis being the actual passion at the time that the crime was committed, and a second axis being the reasonableness of that degree of passion. For instance, you walk in on your wife engaged in flagrant activities with your boss, and your level of actual passion would be deemed extremely high in that case, and the reasonableness of that level of passion would be extremely high. If instead you walked in on your wife reading a book about what a horrible human being Hamilton was, Freud's level of passion might be extremely high, but someone on the outside might consider that level of passion to be somewhat unreasonable. So what he did was he looked at all of the case holdings that came down over a period of time, and he identified them because he had two axes of variation into four quadrants. So he has A, B, C, D quadrants. And he showed that at one point in the 1800s, the quadrants were fairly narrow, and only if the level of passion was seen as being extremely high and the reasonableness was extremely high, the case would rule on the side of it being an excusable manslaughter as opposed to an outright murder. Then he looked forward at the cases over the next 50 years and saw that the cases moved so that a much less level of passion was enough to allow the person to be excused on both axes. So now those four quadrants are still the same four quadrants, but the intersection of the four quadrants had moved down towards the lower left. And he could plot the cases against that. And then he looked at where there were basically a cluster of cases in each one of the quadrants, and the direction that the centroid had moved over time. Then he was able to project forward that if the trend continues in analyzing future cases, you would be able to assume that if the courts keep moving in the same direction, that there's a likelihood that a case would fall in a different quadrant. So if you just looked at all the cases together without that historical perspective, you'd be more likely to guess wrong as to what the court was going to do. But if you observed that that division of the quadrants was moving over time, you'd be able to project more reasonably. Then, of course, going a little bit beyond what Stewart did, imagine that there was some really hot public case in which someone who'd been excused for manslaughter under the weaker standard went out and did something horrific. You could then imagine that the courts would rein that back in and start pulling in the opposite direction to make it harder to get excused on the lesser charge.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously that's a matter of what is in the metadata, which is a really important part of the discussion. I'm just looking in the chat here as well at what Adam is, excuse me, it was Alan. No, who put it in? Oh yeah, it was Adam. If you can all have a look at that, that's a nice kind of visualization. But yeah, we do need to maybe decide on what kind of data, what kind of documents we're really looking at.
Also, before I posted in a link to a paper with statistics on what books become bestsellers, and that has a number of data visualizations there. So it's looking at bestsellers across genres, how long books are bestsellers, and a whole bunch of interesting statistics in that paper.
What is the priority right now? Like across the board, Fred?
The priority is, well, that's a great question. For me, it is really, really important that visual meta becomes a standard or something better takes over. I really don't give a monkeys. I just think that our documents need to know what they are to have an interactive environment. To do this, we need to show how beautiful and useful it can be. And then we need to do all the steps to get there. Showing how beautiful and useful it can be is damn difficult, as this conversation shows. It's really hard because we are
I think
trying to invent a new faculty for how we interact with information, right? Because this is beyond reading and writing. This is something that only a computer system can make happen. Yeah, Peter?
Okay.
I think the most useful thing we could do, certainly for Vint, would be to expand on that little usage scenario that Frode sent out to us yesterday and come up with a scenario of interacting with that high visual metadata set. It doesn't even need to be live necessarily. If we could just come up with some static representations that Vint could use as a series of 4 or 5 slides depicting what a supercomputer-backed 10 million document visual meta enriched system might be like to interact with, so that he could tell a little story of an imaginary user focusing in on something really important that wouldn't be possible but for the existence of that rich visual meta augmenting the data set.
Yeah, I mean, before I hand over to Mark, just wanted to say, as Alan came in and asked that brilliant question, the issues you mentioned, Peter, number one, who was the advisor and what was prior cases? That's extra metadata. It's not in visual meta now, who cares? It could be for that field crucial to put in. In author, I put down who my teachers are, right? So part of this discussion to fantasize is exactly to think of what extra fields would be natural and easy to put in and which would be useful. Yeah, Mark? Mr. Mute, Mark?
Yeah, Mr. Mute, right, sorry, and remember to take my hand down as well. Right, I was just thinking, in the context of what you said, one of the things I think we need to do is to be, mindful that we can't just sort of go for one example. I think what floats about for different disciplines is significantly different. That
Absolutely.
if we just took something that makes sense to so a historian, say, as opposed to someone who's a computer programmer or a mathematician, that because the lines that they're drawing are very different. Well, one's more argumentation based, so it's a different cut on the metadata, I guess is what it boils down to. So I think one of the questions is how few examples, sort of broad domain groupings, can we get away with? Because we need to make sure we cover at least most of the audience, lest we get the usual thing of someone said, "Oh, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not interested," which is unfortunately all too often, the response when somebody's shown something that's marvelous, but it doesn't look like, what they do. I can certainly see on the art side, there's a lot more to do with things like influences. It's these skeins of information that lie outside the actual citation. It's sort of contextual data that's never quite captured, and it's ways in which the information in the document and in the visual meta allow us to show, and I think it is a visual thing, relationships that you just don't get by reading from, page 1 to page N, or indeed location 0 to location N, if you're on a e-reader sort of thing.
On that point and Alan's point, the presentation Vint happens to be doing is computing and the humanities. So we kind of have a field already based on that.
Okay, if I got a comment on that, but I don't want to eat up airtime. If anybody else has something.
If someone wants to put on a cartoon hand, please do. Otherwise, yeah, Alan, please go ahead for now.
It's a little bit of a divergence thought from, I've been reading the Masters of the Word is a book that I pick up every few months. Anyway, in there they talk about the invention of spaces in between words. and how that was so fundamental. It was an ancient invention, went away, and then it came back during the time of the monks transcribing, and suddenly what used to take two people, speaking and then someone else transcribing it, putting it on text, could suddenly be done with one person, right? It was a massive fold, and then it enabled, there was a spillover of benefits. I say that to lead to, I don't know if you have the use case figured out, or if you're still kind of like pitching for what that can be, but something that Ian from Codex Editor sort of works on and plays with, I'm a big advocate of what he's doing there, led me to a kind of an idea, which is his original idea, I guess. But if we went even farther than 10 million documents, right, and said, new baseline, all historical documents, all correspondence has been decomposed into data. And so now the first step of imagination here is I can see the geolocation of every event that's happened around me for the last 200 years. But that's just the beginning. That assumes an interface that is sort of like Google Maps. And then the step two is an interface that's sort of like Twitter, right? Where you could maybe search a topic, and then, or as you grow out your kind of passive search, which I think would be a critical part of any kind of massive future database, is not a intentional search, but a passive growing search. Then you would get these results from space and time that are beyond your imagining. It could become, I would think, the standard way of learning history and learning about our world is no longer in this, here's a book I'm going to read on Hamilton, but this passive, this person said this thing about Hamilton or Hamilton's brother, and I don't really understand it. And then you kind of go down that rabbit hole. But picturing that kind of world is so alien to us that I think it would be interesting to try it out. Anyway, I just bring that for brainstorming.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right in on that one. So many things. First of all, what we're talking about here already exists in the sense that we can access these more than 10 million documents through Google. Let's just, keep that at the forefront. What we're talking about here is presenting the user with an interactive environment. So in some sense, there's nothing new except the interactivity. And as we all would agree here, interactivity is obviously key. To be able to represent it in different dimensions, time and space, yes, is absolutely crucial. I mean, I don't know if you guys are the same, but if I want to find a phone number to a place, I go to Maps, find the place, and then click on it, right? Because it's the right place. And so I see a lot of heads nodding. So we're beginning to think like that. But since you're all being kind and mentioning Hamilton a lot, a week or two ago, I was sitting in a Starbucks in London. Someone mentioned, I'm in a street where Angelica Church lived in London. I saw it was 10-minute walk down the road. I went there, which was great. So it's part of that Hamilton story, but there wasn't an address for a specific house. It was only a short street. So this system would have to deal with fuzzy spaces too. If you say King so-and-so was in London in 1200, there is no specific, that's a fuzzy spot, right? So that's a whole new and interesting dimension to metadata. In military intelligence, you have different ratings. A piece of intelligence by itself is nothing. It has to have gradings and ratings of how reliable it is. If it's human from a trusted source, is it firsthand, secondhand? All of that has to be graded. So now we're going into making metadata as messy as possible. But as long as we do what Peter came up with, which I really, really like, having that errata page in Visual Meta, an extra page that says this is good or this is bad, is if we use that notion for quality of trust as well, people can tear away that page or add their own page, and it adds that layer of context to how fuzzy this stuff was. Yeah, Mark.
I just thinking to try and, when you say, so what are we going to do? Is trying to, what are the things that computers can't do. A lot of things we're talking about is something that if I have a bigger computer and I collect enough stuffs and I put it all in a thing and an algorithm does something with it, wonderful things occur. But that's happening anyway. I think what you know, for instance, what your tools are beginning to allow us to do is to write. You know, one of the things I'm trying to do for future of text is, you know, how do you write if you know that your text will be remediated? In fact, you don't even know what form your text will be read in. So old-fashioned notions and narrative, unless you're writing a novel, are actually a bit broken. You know, they don't actually help you. You have to start thinking in new ways about, you know, how modular and how well connected things are. So it brings me back to this sense of, if I can see lots of documents, even if in my mind rather than on screen, is what are the things that I might want to do that I can't just rely on a cold dead algorithm doing for me. The algorithm will get me all the bits of information. It won't tell me why they're significant. You know, I mean, all this sort of TDIF stuff, whatever it's called, you know, it's fine. Well, if someone uses a quite fixed vocabulary, but a lot of people don't. And the more you go into deeper writing, you will find that you can't, you know, they're not writing with a child's vocabulary that's very small, where that you can always find the right word and you can infer from it. So, yeah, well, I mean, what VM should allow us to do is to populate interesting thinking spaces. And I think that's where we want to push our consideration. I mean, the computery part will get faster and it will get more efficient. It will get wonderful in all sorts of new ways, but I don't see it thinking like humans anytime soon. What we could do with is things that allow us to basically expand our RAM size, you know, our internal desktop, where we can play around ideas, do this relationship making that we do rather well, or we certainly do much better than simple binary systems at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is about new metadata fields, like what Alan talked about, but that's something that if in a specific field that is worthwhile, the system should support putting that in. It should be simple to even say, you know, this is where I wrote this document because it's relevant. Yeah, wow, so many hands. Okay, Peter.
As I go talking with my mute button held down, sorry about that. I think it would be really useful to have just sort of like a fuzzy field somewhere to handle something like this book was inspiring. For instance, the university we need is a book that inspired me to go off and create my Founders Quadrangle project. So it would be incredibly useful if I could indicate somewhere that I'm citing this book as the inspiration for something, not necessarily a direct quote from it, but this text was what inspired my next stage of research. So then we could sort of ask the question, what books are the most productive, which is to say, cause people to go off and do things. And that'd be a really useful kind of a query to run. And of course, conversely, you might find a book that would convince you that your current line of research was a dead end and lead you to shift gears, and you should be able to indicate that with some sort of a signal.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. But just quickly before you, Brendan put in a document here, which I downloaded and opened in Reader. It looks interesting and relevant. It was quite nice though, because Reader says there's a DOI, should I turn it into visual meta? And it did, and it works. But that is, of course, only self-citation. It isn't the internal structure and all of that stuff. But yeah, thank you for that fun bit. Alan.
Right. Going back a little bit, this is more just a value statement. I definitely agree with looking at what computers can't do today, right? And not just thinking about perpetuating what are computers. I take some issue with the idea that all this stuff is in computers already, or in the internet already, or Google.
Oh, I just meant that there are many documents there. They're not
No, that's fine. But what I mean,
format.
but exactly what we're talking about is decomposing from the document layer to actual usable entities. And there's very little has been done there, and there's very little imagination in that space about how to do it,
Yeah.
which is what we're talking about.
Yes.
And thirdly, I'd say that the innovations that I think are some of the most interesting, I'll take one example, would be Twitter, is technologically boring. It did nothing very new. All the information, all the pieces were there. So it was entirely a user experience.
Yeah.
Right. And that is what led to a transformation that we couldn't conceive of ahead of time. Right. Those are the inflection points that I'm interested in identifying. And they are very hard to pitch ahead of time, because if you pitched on a big stage, Twitter, people will be like, I don't care. I forgot email. I have email. Why would I need to use this?
And,
right.
And there are discussion groups, and there's Facebook.
Yeah. Right. And so granted, it's hard to pitch that, but that's the kind of, I think if we can think towards those little inflection points and advantages, we get a lot farther. And so a lot of that has to do with it being frictionless and passive and unconscious. I'll cede the chair.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, Brendan.
Yeah, I love that point. I'll preface by saying I was having internet issues at the start, so if you have mentioned what I'm about to say, just cut me off. But you've hit on a few topics. Wrote one of the things you wrote about kind of renewing Joe's story in the email that you sent. Really insightful, because it almost offers some pain points that Joe might go through. So I imagine this as I am Joe in the future, and I am searching for something and I don't know the answer. I've run into an issue where there's a gap in my knowledge. I'm going through some exploratory search or even focus search to find what I'm looking for, but that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost like a fill in the blank area. So if I imagine this through the metaphors, I'm writing a sentence on, what I'm trying to learn, and I have a blank there that I can fill in. That would be very, very useful for pointed research to come in and assist me. So Alan, you'd kind of mentioned this concept of, the user experience of Twitter really enabling the larger whole. And it's almost a kind of a shared finder in this case, that we all have our individual finders, we all have Google that we can call upon, but there isn't necessarily this shared universe that can port into my context. So that's how I think about this from like the standpoint of visual meta being really tied to individual blocks or pages across the web as a source of insight that I can then tap into, Joe can tap into to resolve her thought.
That is huge. This book that I showed earlier, there's a great paragraph here talking about is that to some extent, of course, all of us are aware of our blind spots, but we nevertheless tend to avoid epistemic vacuum. What a pretentious sentence, right? But it basically says, we don't know, and our brains have to do it. Like even in a room, we do not know everything in the room that we're sitting in now. We can't make a drawing out of it. We have to make up shit, right? So if we can make this system actually help us see what's missing. Right. Oh yeah, I see. Thanks, Fabian. Hope you will feel more interactive next time. Yeah, I need to go in a few minutes too, unfortunately. Yeah, so with Dave King yesterday, some things he finds interesting is Vannevar Bush Trails things. Because even if you're reading a document, if you can be tracked, or going through this, you can be tracked. Imagine you read a book like The Future of Text, which is huge. You're not going to read everything. So at the end, when you just define, okay, I'm done for now. What if the system can say, based on what you actually read, you may also be interested in this other stuff. Or this is a huge bit, according to other threads or trails, that you didn't touch on. Or it can say, your community, Adam, Mark, they have read this stuff. Why don't you have a look at that, right? So to help us with the unknown unknowns, and no, it wasn't Rumsfeld, it was in the Pentagon a long time before him, is absolutely crucial. I mean, we're still in a world where people have all kinds of excuses about climate change, right? I actually had on Facebook today, somebody posted, yesterday, today, whatever, posted a picture of someone looking relieved saying, oh, it turned out it was just a climate change protester. It wasn't a dog that I hit with my car, right? I've been part of Extinction Rebellion in streets. We're not stopping emergency vehicles. They can go around. If you do it on a highway, of course, that's wrong. But we're still in a point where people, including ourselves, I'm sure, have massive blank spots that we aren't even aware of. So if we can have this space of our knowledge in our field and we can, hang on, why is that missing? That would be a huge, anyway, just 5 minutes of me agreeing with what you said. Peter?
With access to the visual meta for a bunch of other documents, we could also have reader reach out and pull in glossary entries beyond the current text. So I could tell it that augment this text with all of the glossary entries and footnotes that anyone who has authored papers to the Hypertext Conference series added related to this term. And then reach out and pull all of that content in. So there might not be a glossary entry for, some particular topic in the document at hand, but someone else in the discourse community that I'm following might have created that entry, or there might be a couple contrasting definitions of it that would all be able to pop up in a little sidebar when I'm highlighting a term that I want more information on. Also, I'd really like to have book indices online as part of the visual meta so that I could reach in and find out if a given term or a person has been referenced, even though that's not necessarily going to show up as a table of contents entry somewhere or a section entry. Conversely, of course, if the term actually is a section heading in addition to being a glossary entry, I want to know about that and have that pop up at the very top of the list. So I know there's an entire section written about Hamilton in the context of hypertext somewhere so that I could zero in on that right away.
I want to just highlight this again. The survey now is 189 responses. And I think all of you here know about the way that we've implemented defining while writing in order to
could you paste in the survey URL? I think I missed it before if you posted it.
It's don't worry. I mean, it's not ready to be properly viewed yet, but I just think this is astonishing, right? So before this question, the students, almost 200 of them, have looked at a video where I say, you come across Hamilton, you define Hamilton, all of that stuff. It's an extra step of work, but it does look like this. Look at this. So strongly agree and agree somewhat are huge. So I think there really is a thirst for people to add metadata, provided it is connected, useful, and can be exploited, not just as a one-off note that's, some of us do anyway. Yeah, Mark?
I just quickly, on that point, I mean, the thing is, it's not actually extra work. It just actually make it easier, because often what you do is you go along your narrative and you're basically blank. Stuff must go here. Narrative continues. Stuff must go here. So in fact, you're doing all this entity extraction and conceptualization after the fact, because we're taught to work in a linear outline style form. So this is actually quite releasing it, and it doesn't actually surprise me that people find the idea interesting. And just to by the by, unknown unknowns, I just put some stuff in the sidebar because I defined it out in my thesis, so I happen to be mentioning that subject, and I think it goes back to Lufton Ingram and it's stuff, beltway agencies and all that sort of thing. But anyway, yeah, so I don't think we should be surprised that people, we should be happy, but I don't think we should be unduly surprised that people actually aren't resistant to the notion of being able to find and extract this sort of data. I see.
We have actually reached a little bit of progress in this chat, I think. One of the key things that these things can do, you know, we talk about surfing the web. We don't really surf the web. We click a few things. But to actually play with a knowledge space, maybe even very richly visually, to see what we don't know, like hermeneutics. I was 52 years old when I came across that term, right? And I'm supposed to be a text guy. That is absolutely unbelievable. It's embarrassing to admit.
Define it, because there's a lot of hermeneutics out there.
Oh,
I thought they were a pop band when I first heard the name.
it's not a very marketable term, that's for sure. But yeah, okay. So what we're talking about is the space of academic documents initially. We're thinking probably within the humanities, because it's not computationally heavy talk and it is this kind of audience. So we're beginning, you know, look, for the thing for Vint, it's not like we have to make a system or even a visual demo. You know, there's 5 minutes for this whole thing, visual meta, author, reader, everything. If it's just 2 slides at the end, saying that over lots of chat, what we found out, this is difficult to think about, but these are the kinds of aspects that should be looked into. That would be success, right?
Well, one kind of thing you could do, we can put it a little back in time just so that no one in the room feels their collars being felt. But you know, things like the construction of how a large treaty or a trade thing came to be, some of the ideas that fed into, you know, the various different parties engaging in it, the documents surrounding it, some of the key documents, and this is stuff that, you know, effectively could be pulling out from metadata. And certainly, you know, when I was doing that spell up with our government, so trying to just explain to me, if you actually record events of note, you will actually be able to find them later, and they will be remarkably instructive. I mean, and I know there are people at the moment actually trying to write semantic structures for how you do peace treaties and things. And I think it plays into the same thing, because at the moment you either have a very, very sort of rigid system that's understandable because it has a rigidity and you can walk through the structure, or you have the woman or man at the other end who just happens to be the expert in this. So you said, well, we'll go ask them. And so ability to surface some of this information and make use of it via things like visual meta is a nice democratization with a very small d of, you know, the way in which we can use the knowledge that's available to us.
Yeah, and make use of the knowledge that's available to us. Yes, we should, you know, as I said, we should look into this field, humanities. However, the whole point of visual meta is that more developers, even much more simple developers, can derive value out of this. It's not coded weird away. But also in terms of inspiration, my Apple Watch just beeped and said that Isaac Asimov's Foundation is now available on Apple TV+. Talk about an inspiration for what information structures can make predictive, right?
This might be off point, but that's not my intent. And additionally, if it is and anybody's interested in this idea and wants to work on it, love to chat about it. It's something that I've been tinkering with. It all relates to the future of text. But one approach that I've been tinkering with is reimagining tags, realizing that links are like a game mechanic. They are great, but they are not sufficient. So what are the other game mechanics? Well, tagging was this new game mechanic. I'm trying to imagine tags as operating in one version as cells in a spreadsheet, where the cell is the sort of the tag name, but in every cell, and you have a formula that you can access, and you can turn it into computation. You can add rules on how it can be applied in its surrounding context. In my mind, that becomes an example of a small passive thing that you can do without having to understand the big picture. It could be as simple as a rule as simple as in these conditions, make this uppercase, or more tangibly, this is this term has these aliases, and in these conditions, say a particular domain, it is metaphorically adjacent to X, right? So it may be that it's not an exact thesaurus-like alias, but in your mind, it has this similarity. And so giving people affordances to do that, it's still very early on. I mean, I imagine it being kind of awful, but as an interface, but I think that there's something there, and it kind of like gets you thinking at the atom level, but back a few dimensions and then putting that at scale. So just a thought to put out there.
I think that is very, very important. I think that, knowledge is messy. I have Bertrand Russell in the other room, and that's the end of his thing. He says, human knowledge is messy. It always will be. It's not going to be objective, hierarchy. I would subscribe to, let's say, Brendan's glossary of VR, let's say, because I know this human being has a reputation. And when I come across other glossaries, it would be nice to have that as a sidebar, so to speak. Or I will, because one of the things that I hate about newspapers, I think I've said it, is that introduction in every story about that little person giving a bit of color, Jim so-and-so went down the road and the car fell on his head, right? Actually, what you want to say is at the end of the world, it's raining cars. So to go through someone's essentially concept map, define terms that link together, would be such an incredibly useful way to enter a field instead of a mass of text. So yes, please. Brendan, I thought you had your hand up as well, actually, or? Sorry, my connection was a bit bad there.
We lost you for a couple of seconds there. I don't think.
Yeah, all I said.
Correct.
I think you. Yeah, sorry. The final thing on that is tags are one thing, but it's easy to throw away a tag, just see what sticks. A defined concept or glossary entry, you have provided the effort to show that this means something to you, so you can connect it to other things. So I think there are many ways we can look at how we can use categorization, like Mark Anderson replied to that email with an article where students today don't understand folder structure, which in some way is fair enough. There should be other ways that we can, organize our data. But anyway, I think I saw another hand up. Is that right?
Now the thought is almost past, but you were talking about, oh yeah, right, you were saying, about tags and being disposable. I just draw a line though from Alan's observation back to your point about the concepts. They don't have to be discontinuous in the sense that part of what I took from what he said is that, okay, this thing that I'm referring to as a tag, effect can be a constructed, defined, and calculated object. So in other words, this tag tomorrow may not be the tag it was yesterday, because the things that feed into it. So it's going from being just a string of words that I put in a box that has a magnifying glass next to it, to being something closer to a fully defined concept where you probably begun to put some hard edges on it. So it's a nice malleable, you've got a sort of conceptual, computational object with which we can start to do the magic of making more than just following the words across the page.
The premise to it is that we think in as humans, we tend to conflate the presentation layer and the data, the underneath entity, the thing we're trying to say, right? All throughout history, we've had this problem. And so the idea is, you're exactly right about the awfulness of tags, especially along a long time horizon. If we gave a way to get access to that lower level, knowing that that lower level is always fluid, but then gave a few pointers as to what it could mean, right? And then this is actually where I want to see AI, not up here coming up with texts, but giving AI pointers on how to understand and mutate these terms. Anyway.
I don't entirely agree with your framing.
Yeah, good. It was off the cuff.
Right. So the whole thing about presentation layer and data layer, I think is a bit wrong, because I will have an intent and write it down or make a movie or whatever. I will make my brain intent into a thing. I will make, in doing so, not only will part of my intent be lost, some of it will be emphasized, some of it I will better understand, but it will be clarified, right? That's part of the point of writing, of course. I think that
Yes.
the assumption that there is something deeper is wrong. I think it's, I don't know what the name of the book is, but there's a pop psychology book on how the human brain is actually quite shallow. It goes into that epistemic void, as in, we make up a lot of shit as we go along. So
well, this is precisely my point. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think we're aligned. It was just that language, because I think if I'm reading something by Raphael, for instance, and the way I view it is there is the stuff that he has framed, that he's written, and there's Raphael behind it. But obviously his own brain didn't have the capacity to put it in there, right? As mine wouldn't either fully. So there would be that additional dialogue with him but I don't think there is necessarily a data and presentation layer separate as such.
Yes, and I have to address this just for a moment, because this is the point. Definitely don't agree in the computer think of data presentation layer, and I don't think even what I was intending to express is that there's a deeper level of thought that, sure, the brain is shallow. What I'm trying to express is exactly this problem, right? I chose the word deeper because I'm trying to get at an intent, express an intent that I myself don't have the words for, that isn't shared and accessible to other people. I picked the word deep, which of course immediately creates this other problem. And I picked a word layer that creates another problem, right? So it's actually less about the truth or the depth as much as it is in this context, I'm not going to know what he meant by deep, him meaning me, but if I put it alongside shallow, if I put it alongside, unknowability and these kinds of, in this particular context, you get a sense that what I meant in the sense of deep may have many other words, right? And so that is where deep, if it were a tag in a particular sentence that I just spoke, you could look at it, intercept it, and see that this doesn't mean deep thinking. It means it has these other connotations. And I only bring that up now because I think it feeds back into the multi-million document approach, that until we get past that kind of low level, this is what deep means in this particular context, and I'm going to spend an entire book discussing what deep means in this context, we're not going to be able to have that portability. Pardon me.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before you, Peter, just really briefly, I can't see what Mark and Peter are fighting over in the.
We're not fighting.
Good fighting. But
I have a constant query running on Twitter that picks up the word hypertext, and most of it is argument all the time. But whether hypertext market language is a programming language, as if it matters at all. It's just one of those things with people with too much time on their hands like to argue about.
So BMQL is fascinating, Peter, of course.
Yeah, so I want to have a language that can reach out and query the visual meta so that we can ask questions about authors who added glossary definitions for terms that appeared in recent hypertext conferences, and be able to get papers by people who quote Hamilton, things like that. So in order to run that sort of a query, the system could draw on an index of the indices that were stored in the visual meta to be able to identify relevant documents. And you have to be able to have a series of descriptors that will narrow down people and papers and concepts to be able to winnow things down to the area that you're interested in. So that means we need something richer than tags, because tags are just attaching a bunch of descriptors, but there aren't any operators associating the descriptors with one another. So if I have hypertext and I have systems, I don't know whether that's about systems implementing hypertext or whether it's about hypertext talking about different systems. So you need to have some sort of connectors there, and we could have a small subset of connectors, and then you could assume that anything that isn't a known term to the system is just an arbitrary descriptor phrase that you're linking together. But there'd be a notion of aboutness, a notion of authorship, a notion of criticism, things at that level that could be used to string the tags together in order to form grammatically meaningful constructs, which you could then query with the query language.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, now when it comes to a query language, there are different ways to do a query, of course. One of them is speaking, one of them is typing, one of them is pulling levers and stuff. They're all ways of interacting with the data. So I think one thing that is becoming interesting is the different kinds of shapes we want to see. We want to see a shape of different sizes of something. We want to see the whole lacuna thing, love that word. But we also want to see effects, something over time, and these are very different things to view and ways to enter it. Of course, visual meta doesn't have much of this yet. But the hope is, as we move along, more and more fields will be added. And because those fields are hopefully obvious to the field that cares about them, these things can become more and more useful.
I'm also quite keen. I mean, the thing I keep sort of waiting for are the spaces like Chris's Weblo and the thing that Gunter seemed to be working on, these open spaces that I go back to the jigsaw analogy. I can tip all, I found all these things, these papers, these entities that are of interest. They have a relationship that interests me. I don't know the form of that relationship. Now what I need is a space where I can play around with it, and where the computer is assisting me rather than working against me by trying to come up with ideas that I didn't give it. And that may be contentious to some. This isn't me being Luddite about what we can do with coding. It's just making space for human thinking to work with some of these technical affordances. So just being able to say, all right, these concepts, these things, whatever they are, have a sort of closer relationship for me than those things. I can put them in separate places. And for that, a 2D is quite enough, I find. And you can have affordances of color and shape and things if you want. I mean, Peter will recognize I'm probably talking about things like tinderbox maps to a degree, but that kind of thing is extremely freeing and useful, especially where there are no lines involved, because lines start to create priorities, and so they actually harm the other potential relationships. Unintentionally, you draw a line and suddenly everything else has no line.
Unless they are
wasn't
lines
what we were
when you
trying
need
to do.
them. See you later, Raphael.
Bye, Raphael.
Bye, Raphael. Yeah, so that and I mean, I don't know how to, that's something I think would be useful to try and work into our, the thing that Vince's talking about. And the question is, so what sort of problem might we try and address with that sort of an approach?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things people are trying to do here. One is to learn about stuff, and the other one is to invent a better world, whether in a big or small way, right? That's the whole point of this. I have to go in a minute as well, but I'm trying to find out the birth of the Codex, right? it's an obvious thing. We've all talked about the history of it. It's actually really messy because there were so many different kinds of codex type things early on. And then
Can you pull that cover up again so I can grab a screenshot?
I'm not sure if you want it, but
Thank you.
I mean, it's like, okay, so this is my desk right now, just for a bit of history. You know, these books to go through, these that are half gone through, it's probably going to be more there. And what I'm
So few books.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to do as kind of a case study, I want to make the point that the use of paper really is what made the Codex useful because of this, that, and the other, right? But to find the sources for that is actually bloody hard. Because a lot of these books, they're absolutely wonderful, but they do not write in a simple, in so-and-so year or decade or period, so-and-so happened. I mean, this is partly why I'm writing the history of text book. So what I think would be really, really wonderful, guys, if all of you could write a document, a paragraph, a sentence, doesn't matter, of in an environment with the kind of metadata that you are interested in, what are the kind of things you want to be able to do? It can be a specific function, or it can be, like Mark was just talking about, more of a, I can use my brain in a different way. Because I think if we have more and more of these calls of pure dreaming, then at some point we can start doing more normal product design, or maybe we don't even do that. I think these dreamings are useful. Just like with Ted Nelson, I love him dearly, but you know, he wants to be a movie director. He wants to have a thing to the world, Zigzag or Xanadu or whatever. He doesn't seem to understand that his deep notion of putting post-its bloody everywhere is one of the prime insights in his world. He thinks in a much more atomic way than academia does, for instance. You know, he can really teach us stuff. I asked him if I can do an interview, and he's being all silly, but just an interview on that. You know, how can we do that thinking? Because we're all taught that, you know, this has value because it's thick. So will you send something, people, please?
Yeah.
Or
Sounds good.
I mean, if you blog it so you have it in your own space, so to speak, and then we link to it, that would be even better. That would be dog fooding, as they say, right?
Yeah. Quickly, Alan, what was the thing you mentioned? You said you've been reading on the sort of the origin of spacing, and is that book about because this thing about reading aloud, and it's another book I've been trying to get.
Yeah, I'm reading a book called The Masters of Word. I'll pull it up. Reading it on Kindle. By
Is it Johnston and Rourke?
How Media Shaped History from the Alphabet to it's by William Bernstein.
How do I
Another it's I don't know, it's a really great, even though it takes a lot of divergences into like Romans and Christians and everything, it does eventually come back around into how it applies to text. So he scratches his historical itch, but I'm really enjoying it. Frode, on the future of text and the volume 2, just a closing point maybe. Would you be interested in a synopsis of version 1? Like, here are the, you know, for the new reader or something, here are the various essays and here are the takeaways and how they relate to each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
I've
would
been
be
taking some notes on, I'm only like 1/3 of the way through it, but I've been trying to reduce down the points. Not to say like this captures it, but here's just an interesting thing. Anyway, go ahead.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, there's 2 main reasons for the book. One, and the least important, in 500 or 1,000 years, people can read what we thought would be the future of text, and therefore also the state of our thinking. That's one. The second one is an 18-year-old frustrated student having a printed copy, underlining every other word, completely ragtag book, reads some weird stuff in there and gets inspired, does something useful. So the more different kinds of writing we have, so if you want to write a kind of review in that sense, that would be wonderful. You know, the less similar the articles are, the better. So yeah, that would be great.
So the thing I've got on the stocks is basically thinking about the still open space of writing tools for writing for remediation. So, you know, not as we're generally doing, writing on a piece of faux paper on screen, and that's not. I mean, and I would give author a pass on that, because that's not the distinction I'm drawing. But it's this thing that if you accept you're not writing for something that's going to be read in a medium that you even know of. So how does that affect how you structure things? And you know, does it need extra affordances? I mean, I think you're addressing this in part with Word and this idea of, you know, the concepts that underlie it, addressability, you know, going back to Doug and things, and these are all relative. But anyway, that's the thing that I'm noodling around with, and I thought I'd get some time when I was away, but it transpired there were too many birds to go and watch. Avian birds, that is.
On that note, I just want to. So there is I closed the wrong document. Excuse me. So these are the 3 quotes in the opening of my thesis as it stands now. Just read them briefly if you don't mind. One is from Ernst Cassirer. He was a German philosopher from 1944. Man has, as it were, discovered a new method of adapting himself to his environment. Between the receptor system and the effector system, which are to be found in all animal species, we find in man a third link, which we may describe as the symbolic system. This new acquisition transforms the whole of human life. As compared with other animals, man lives not merely in broader reality, he lives, so to speak, in a new dimension of reality. Nice sentence from someone who's not well known, but there's a lot of male in there. Anyway, so the Doug one, I'm sure you know. What if in your office, you as an intellectual worker were supplied by a computer display, backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day, was instantly responsive to every action you had? How much value could you derive from that? And then finally, on the next page, I write first, here I ask, what if in your office, you as an intellectual worker were supplied with richly interactive documents backed up by an environment that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive to every action you had? How much value could you derive from that? Just a bit of poetry. And the thing that it adds, sorry, Mark, that just by rewriting Doug's sentence, an environment that's alive for you all the time. It's not just about an active query. You know, these things should be able to do stuff and kind of alert us to new relationships developing and stuff. Yeah, sorry.
No, I think it was interesting, and I didn't mention, I did have a read through your doc this morning. In fact, it's still open on my desktop. But just a passing thought, without intending to derail, it's another anti-pattern thing. Really, is it begs the question: if we have so many of these wonderfully rich and linked documents, what that's going to do for our current work style, where we normally start our in tray, and we don't anymore, but we take the thing off the top of the in tray, do it, put it in the out tray. Of course, I mean, well, it's a bit like falling down the rabbit hole on the web, and we're going to transport that even closer into our workspace. So I don't think it's a problem for us to necessarily address, but it's an interesting side note as to the challenges that's going to pose. How do you stay on point when there are so many interesting side quests on offer as you interact with your rich document?
Absolutely. And on that note, 2 minutes left, so we're only half an hour over. Any other thoughts of today other than I look forward to reading your email or messages about a dream moment you could have with this?
Yeah, it would be to put that request in text somewhere, email, whatever form we have outside of this. If you just want the prompt, even if it's just on Twitter or something, or to us, I don't know, it'll help me.
Okay, I'll do that now. So let's write it together. What would you like to be able to do? Help me formulate the question, guys. What would you like to be able to do if you could interact with and view 10 million documents on one screen? Is that what we're asking?
I don't like that.
That's not quite it, is it?
It's a vanity metric. So what's a better question?
I can't help but feel that one of the reasons it's harder to collapse down is what you might do with this will be quite different depending. I'm not trying to blow the thing further apart, but it is in a sense the easiest way I can collapse slightly is depends on the domain in which you're thinking. Are you looking for relationships that run over time? So teacher-pupil relationships where people have worked under one another, or where this technology has influenced that. In a more technical sphere, you're probably looking at other things. You're looking about where something was proven, something more empirical. At what point or in what place was some fact that you wish to lean on proven to be now an approved fact? In other words, allowing you to stand on that step to go beyond. And I think they're quite different things. They can both be done in that space, but I don't think they mash together particularly well. And I'm sure someone with a broader view of the disciplines would know better than I'm. There are probably another couple of variants on that help cover the round. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of causing a logjam in the definition at this point. So that at the overall scale of what fabulous stuff you could do, yes, it makes sense, and I think we can all think, oh, it would be nice to have fabulous stuff. If we then all step back and say, well, what would I be doing at the point where I wanted this fabulous stuff? That's something we perhaps need to burrow into. Not to over specify it, but simply to help give it shape.
Guys, help me with the question.
I thought I just did.
No, you made it worse. Well, more complicated. Alan wants this question in writing. So all we're doing here is trying to please Alan, as always.
Yeah.
So what are we going to put on Twitter? What's the better question to remind ourselves?
Well, let me take another punt at it. It's saying, what would the ability to interact with all these documents allow you to do that you can't do at the moment? I mean, ostensibly, you have a computer that may have these tens of thousands or millions of documents already on it, and as has been said, in a sense, it's all out there. So having this extra layer of metadata, and you might need to find a less sort of scary term for some people than metadata. What would that extra layer of information allow you to do that you can't at present?
Oh, that's easy. It would save me having to take the time to manually retrieve all of those documents to look at them in order to answer the metadata level query. Currently, I am dramatically slowed down by having to rely on interlibrary alone to pull in obscure items and texts I only have access to for a limited time before they have to go back to their host libraries. And if all that metadata was available, I'd be able to pull them in when they're most relevant to me, or maybe even avoid spending the time to pull them in, because the metadata alone would allow me to winnow them out of my search.
You're answering the question. We just need a quick way to ask the question now.
And having done the winnowing thing, which is a massive convenience of itself, but probably doesn't appear that sexy to the tire kicker sitting at the back of the room. Having done that winnowing, what sort of visual meta queries can you envisage then asking, either are more deliberate? So you've winnowed away all the chaff, which, as you say, takes a massive amount of time, and we're all familiar with that problem. Having got to that point, are there different sorts of questions that you might still be able to ask that you can't at the moment, because, for instance, it would require you to read every paper, create your own annotation space for it.
You're also
And then
being
query that.
helpful.
Sorry?
You're also being helpful. Don't give me an answer. Let's get the question, because we're running way out of time, but it's very useful that Alan is being a bit difficult on how to phrase this, because we could bring in more people into the question. Hey, look, asking the right question is much harder than getting the right answers, right, guys?
Yeah.
This may not be the right question, but
42.
maybe a template for kind of what I'm looking for would be, you have just read 10 million documents. How did you do it?
I'm going to put read in quote marks, because obviously there's different meanings of read.
And that itself is a very rich and useful thing to flout.
I'm going to tag it visual meta, of course. By the way, I'm not sure if you all know, but for the visual meta, we made one change, and that is it no longer has that extension section. It's just
Good move.
because
That was-
hang on.
You're going to say we put it in green text instead.
Boom. Visual, boom. I've tweeted it. Gotta go. You guys are amazing. And I just got a build of author that I have to test, so it's all a bit much. I hope to see you guys on Monday, whoever can. It's always lovely. And if there's any agenda you have that's outside of this, just push it. It's the future of text. Right now, we're back, as we keep into the visual meta thing. But please understand that visual meta is an approach. It's not a specific thing only. So it can go quite loose. And so forth and so on, and have a good weekend. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Have a
Yeah.
good weekend. Stay safe.
Adam,